This is the Ogden Museum's Richardson Society Artist Conversation with John Alexander and Curator of the collection, Bradley Sumrall. Together, they will explore the narrative and symbolism in Alexander's work. Throughout the webinar, we welcome you to click the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen and send any questions you may have, and they'll be answered live by John and Bradley. So now I'll pass it on to Bradley, and I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video just so I don't distract y'all.
Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you all.
Well, welcome to this live conversation between artist John Alexander and myself, Bradley Sumrall, curator of the collection for the Ogden Museum of Southern Art in New Orleans. And today we're going to explore the narrative of nature and the ecological symbolism in Mr. Alexander's work. A little about John Alexander. Most of you already know the work well, but for posterity, I'll give a little overview of John. And John has a career that's moved from the bad boy of Texas art to celebrated master of American figurative painting. He's maintained a strong voice in the contemporary art dialogue for over 40 years. And he's had major retrospectives at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and has had celebrated exhibitions at the Meadows Museum in Dallas, where he hung right next to Goya, and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, where he hung right next to the wonderful Walter Anderson. His work is included in the public collections of leading museums throughout the country, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the Smithsonian American Art Museum in DC, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and the LA County Museum, LACMA. And he's in many public and private collections worldwide, including many right here in New Orleans. You might have one in your living room right now. As an educator, he can count artists such as Julian Schnabel and Sharon Capriva as students. And he recently received an honorary doctorate of fine art from the New York Academy of Art, a Lifetime Achievement Award from Guild Hall in the Hamptons, and an Opus Award from the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. And he currently divides his time between Soho, Manhattan, and Amagansett, Long Island, where he's talking with us today from. So thank you, John, for joining us. Now, before we dive into the work, I want to read a few lines I recently wrote about John for a show he had in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I think it was a highly successful show. But I think this one little paragraph that I wrote really speaks to what we'll be talking about today. So indulge me. John Alexander may have left the South 40 years ago, but the landscape and culture of his Texas home still permeates every inch of his surfaces. His work is deeply rooted in the wild bayous of his childhood, but it's also forged in the crucible of formal training, tempered through immersion in the works of masters such as Goya and Inzer, and refined through years of relentless and focused studio production. Throughout his career, symbolism and narrative have guided each brushstroke, each line, each composition. Through drawing and painting, John Alexander captures the savage beauty and the heroic martyrdom of the natural world, as well as the darker side of human endeavor. His work is not art for art's sake. His work is art for humanity's sake, a cautionary tale of an impending environmental apocalypse and a reminder of what might be lost. So John, thank you for being here with us. Would you like to say anything to start this off?
Well, first of all, I can say, looking at the screen, I see your happy, smiling face, which I'm always glad to see. But what I'm seeing below us is that little red-orange square with the O in the middle of it. And I have to say that it once again gives me a pause and to think how much that Ogden Museum means not only to the city of New Orleans, but the South in general, and to a myriad of artists to have access to a great institution that they would, without the Ogden, they would not have access to. And it's been very good to me, and I have been involved one level or another throughout the almost entire existence of it. And I'm very proud to be a part of this and thank them again for putting something like this on. And that's really what I want to say is a shout out to everyone that's working at the Ogden, especially during this extraordinarily difficult time and trying to keep that institution running on even keel. And you're brave and you're courageous, and I'm really thank you for that. And I hope that this brings some opportunity that we can maybe spend a little time together where we're not having to think about this siege that we're under, which is very, very troubling to say the least. So let's all settle back, and in a minute I'll relax and start being myself. So let's just get started.
Well, absolutely. And John, I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. And, you know, when I was a young curator, just really getting started, I got an introduction to you and went up to your studio in New York, and my mind was blown, you know. And I think through that exhibition, which was a really fine exhibition, it's an exhibition I'm very proud of, you know, we've become friends, and I count myself very lucky for that. But speaking of getting our minds off of our current situation and digging into your work, I'm going to share some images, and these are going to be chronological, starting around 1980, I believe, and really just kind of start with the Neches River, which is where it all starts. I do believe. All right, hold on, let me get this going. And there it is, the Neches River Nightmare, 1981. All right, got a motorcycle outside.
Wow. Well, I will, would you like me to say a few, should we be specific about each particular painting? Let's do that.
Sure, and I think, you know, your first drawing that I believe you consider successful was of this same subject, obviously in a different style. But I think we just talk about maybe the inspiration of your work, because the Neches River and that basin and those bayous and bogs and floodplains around the Neches River that's the introduction, the prologue to your entire body of work, really.
Well, is there a way for me for the camera to show me right now?
It is.
Yeah, all right. We don't have a reproduction, but I'll show it to you in the book. The picture of the first Neches River picture I did in 1961 when I was still in high school. How do we show that?
Here, let me stop share for a minute.
Oh, there we go. Okay. It's hard to see, but it'll give you the idea. This is kind of, there you go. This is a little high school watercolor that I did for my art class with some old abandoned cabins and these old kind of gnarly cypress trees that I fell in love with as a child growing up in the backwaters of the Neches River and Sabine River and the bayous that run into them. And that's been the most prominent image that I keep returning to in my work over it. And then the one on that drawing I did when I was 5 years old. I can't spell any better now than I did then, but there's the earliest, my mother kept that. And when she passed, I got it. But this is the earliest one that I have a record of directly from observation. When you actually, I went out to the bank of the river, looked at that scene and painted it with a watercolor kit and some ink. That Neches River and the flora and fauna of that region, because I was, as a child, fortunate in many ways and unfortunate in others, because my father was so old when I was born that I didn't get to have him in my life. And out of my teen years, but in those early years, he and I spent hours upon hours camping and fishing and spending our time in the backwaters of the Neches River. And so I said to Bradley the other day, if I paint the seacoast of Maine, it ends up looking like the Texas-Louisiana border, because that's just so seeped in who I am as a person. And I think that it's important, if you're going to talk about my symbolism and my imagery, that I make it clear that I believe that if you're going to paint any particular subject, that you need to have a deep and fanatical understanding of what it is you're doing and why are you doing it. Most artists, I won't say that, but many artists, they just, they work on things. They do, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But the greatest art to me that I find most compelling historically is art in which the painter or sculptor is completely immersed in it and brings a kind of religious ferocity and intensity to their feeling and passion about the work. If you look at the way the great Rembrandt painted the portraits of noblemen and so forth, that was one thing done masterfully. But when he painted himself in the sadness of his life after his daughter was gone and his wife, he'd lost his wife and his daughter, and he was no longer the king of society. He was poor and out of work, and he painted these extraordinarily heartfelt pictures about something he knew extremely well, which was his self and his suffering. And that kind of art resonates with me. And I feel the same way about the landscape because I have such a profound love for it. And yet that landscape, as we all know that are older, that grew up in the Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas, they know that that landscape has been really overrun with tragedy and sadness from the paper companies, the creosote plants, chemical plants, pesticides, overpopulation, logging industry, and yet it still has somehow managed to maintain an integrity and a beauty and a resonance that if you look deeply into it, it's some of the most compelling and beautiful landscape on earth. So a lot of my paintings go up and down from trying to paint a very beautiful romanticized vision of that, depending on my psychological state, and others that are very troubling and scary. So let's look at that in that context. Let's look at the Neches River, thinking about the one we just saw as a teenager. And now let's look at this one.
Well, I think we've talked about this before. It's a different world than the forests of Maine.
Yeah. Well, this painting here, if you look at this painting, first of all, I want you to all notice the fish with their heads sticking out of the water, because that fish comes back over and over again in my work from throughout its entirety. This is 1981. You have to understand the context of this. In 1981, I had left in 79 a studio, a big studio that I'd built in Houston near downtown. I had a comfortable job at the university. I was somewhat successful for Texas artists. I'd had shows at the Museum of Contemporary Art. I'd had shows in San Antonio, museum shows around. And I was very, very lucky to have such a career early on. But I decided one day to just pack it all up, got a U-Haul or Ryder rental truck, and left my job, left my beautiful studio, left my dear, dear friends in Texas, left my wife, left my beloved cat, and moved to New York. So now 1 year later, when I'm in New York established, you can only imagine at 1 o'clock in the morning in a Soho studio, me trying to paint my memory of the Nature's River and my vision of the Nature's River. Everything in my mind and my life was up in an upheaval. And at that time also, the landscape was in a state of upheaval because the real environmental rules and laws hadn't quite kicked in yet. So you still read stories about the water catching on fire or in the ship channel, or the incredible fish kills. So many fish were dying in our bayous and our rivers. And it was a deeply, deeply disturbing time for the environment. So this painting reflects a lot of that. And it's like my entire world had come apart with that move, and my entire world had come apart because I was not able to go out anymore in a boat and go back into that nature and into that world I love so much and see it. I was literally in a studio in New York. I never really questioned if I'd made the wrong move. It's too early for that yet, but I was deeply, deeply confused and very, very, very uncomfortable in the direction my art would take. So we picked, Bradley and I, a very disturbing picture of the Nature's River tributaries and to start. And so we'll go from here.
Well, the next image is one from the Ogden's permanent collection, this Aquitaine etching called Feast Fit for a King. And this is an example of very, very overt symbolism in your work. And it still holds on to that frenetic, violent, mark-making aesthetic that you were known for in the 1980s. But for me, I think, the use of the crowns, the use of the halos is some of the most overt and kind of over-the-top symbolism in your work.
Well, if you think about exactly the date here, we're talking about 1984. I'm living in Soho. The galleries, are, in those days, there was only about 30 galleries in Soho, maybe, but 40. But that art scene there was beginning to explode, not unlike this painting. This is when Mary Boone started to show all the young artists like Eric Fischel and Julian Schnabel and Ross Bleckner and David Sally and those, and Susan Rothenberg and all these men and women who became icons of American art out of that period. This is when that explosion took place. So when you think of the term feast, I use that a lot in my work, feast fit for a king. Well, yes, but maybe there's a feast now. There's a feast in Soho. Maybe there's opulence and money and gold Cadillacs and Studio 54. But I suspected, just because I'm a pessimist, that this was not going to last. These crowns that everyone is wearing with great pride in the art world, maybe they're going to end up like that skeleton at the bottom. This party will come to an end. And sure enough, by 1989, when the financial collapse hit, it all kind of really went haywire. Not that I'm a Nostradamus, but I really felt trouble. I felt a sense of trouble in all this opulence and wealth and the overselling of the art world. So in many ways, this is kind of my statement about it. My herons from down home, from the bayous, are up there in New York, kind of like on it's an unsettling environment. Is it a table? Is it the water? Who does that skull belong to? The three kings. It's also got ample biblical religious symbolism, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. I use all kinds of threes, and because I don't know that we have enough time in an hour to get into all the religious symbolism in my work, and maybe we should avoid that today, but that's for another discussion if we ever do it again. So that's kind of that piece right there. There's a lot of crazy energy went into that one explosion of emotion.
Such a beautiful print.
What?
Now this one of your masterpieces, in my opinion, one of the greatest paintings you've ever produced, and it's huge, by the way. I didn't put sizes on this thing, but it's huge.
I think
Glory
it's,
Bound, 1993. Now this one, the narrative runs deep on this, so I'd like you to just walk us through it.
I think it's 12 feet wide and 8 feet high. Well, there's a lot of stories that go along with this picture. One is that it came directly from when I was a little boy. So much of my work is I've gotten older and I've become comfortable with talking to psychiatrists and sharing my feeling. I've learned how to feel as an old man, but I was madly in love as a little boy with these old locomotives from the 1950s that still burned coal, and they were black with silver fronts, and they puffed and huffed and puffed, and they blew steam and smoke out everywhere. And they were these gigantic sculptural behemoths that huffed and puffed through downtown Beaumont. And you know, we lived near a railroad track near downtown when I was little. And we would, as children, go climb on them and sneak rides on them and jump on as they were moving slowly from one place to another. And so they moved one of these big trains at the end of their reign of power and, you know, beauty. And started using more modernized looking trains. They put this train in the middle of Central Park in Beaumont as a, you know, for kids to play on. And a lot of towns around the South had a train in the middle of the park. And so this was Beaumont. But I was in South America in a very, very remote tropical rainforest at the headwaters of the Amazon. And I was living in this camp with these thatched roofs and piranha and giant snakes and weird stuff all around. But it was shockingly beautiful and hauntingly powerful to be in. I'd never been in a rainforest before. And this was in '93. I just done an exhibition in Caracas, Venezuela, when there actually was still a Caracas and a lot of money there. And the dealer arranged for me to go down to this rainforest. And in all its grandeur and beauty, somehow in my twisted mind, as I was laying there in my camp, I just had this imaginary vision of the sound of chainsaws in the distance. And then I got all depressed and weird about it because I thought, sure enough, this is not going to be here for long. This is all going to be destroyed. And they're going to have logging trains come in. They're going to have I was reliving in my mind what happened to the Southeast Texas woods and the big thicket swamp. It was so beautiful and so tropical and gorgeous in its majestic beauty and compelling imagery. So when I came back, I did a lot of drawings of this exact image. I still have them. And there were all these birds and all these strange, wonderful little creatures. There were a lot of monkeys and people in the jungle shooting monkeys with blowguns with painted faces. It was really, I was way in the hell back there. So when I came back to New York, I was unable to get this out of my mind, this whole thing. So I went down to Beaumont and I took a lot of photographs of the train. And then I did some drawings of the train. Then I brought those back to New York and I composed this picture of a train coming out of a tunnel toward you, this 1950s locomotive in 1993 with these birds looking at it thinking, what the hell is this? What is this doing in our yard? What is this doing in our neighborhood? And it was, in my opinion, extraordinarily powerful and beautiful. And also the symbolism, because that's what our subject is, the symbolism of the gorgeous birds juxtaposed in an environment with this fire-breathing locomotive is powerful enough. But when you look at the title, it's called Glory Bound, which is, again, very biblical and straight out of, you know, like my work, some of it comes so straight out of the book of Revelation. So anyway, here's this train, glory bound. And this train is bound for glory, is one of the old spirituals from the 1930s or 40s says. The words go, as many of you must probably know that spiritual. But anyway, that was in there. I kept thinking of that. So that's where the title came from. And then I put the number 666 across the front of the locomotive, which are in some kind of mythology, you know, kind of voodoo symbolism, is the symbol of the devil. So I was portraying the train, even though I loved its beauty and I climbed on them and I thought they were majestic. It also represented evil because it was coming in to destroy this forest. So that's a 5-minute summation of something that took me about a year and a half to do. And it's more complicated than that, but that's your cliff notes of what happened.
Well, it's one of my favorites for sure. Now, this is a more subtle symbolism. We're going a lot more subtle in what you're portraying here. And again, another masterful piece. I believe this belongs to our friend David Berg. The Mighty Bog, 4 years later, 1997. It's similar to a piece that belongs to Bill Goldring called 10 Mile Bayou, and I believe it's the same subject, the same piece of land, maybe.
Same landscape, same piece. This was a very large painting from, actually, his is earlier. His is from 1995. This is 1997. Actually, Bill's painting was a precursor to this, and I did this painting on a much, much larger scale. But yes, it's the same subject, same.
We talked a little bit about how you're, and I'm sorry we don't have a good image of 10 Mile Bayou, but let's just say it's the same landscape, but all of the trees are healthy. It's a romanticized, very, very healthy looking forest.
Well, there's a reason for that.
Right.
And if any of you want to see it, I'm sure you just go show up at Bill's house. He'll let you in and you can just go see it. And or maybe it's in his office. But
It's in his office.
This painting, see, something happened. My life experience, I'm a very big believer in the idea that your environment and your psychological attitude, if your work is honest, and I hope that my work is brutally honest, but certainly it's taken me through some big changes in life and some unpleasant parts of my life and some very powerful and uplifting parts of my life. I've lived many extremes in my long life. And what happened is that at the end of the 80s, when you saw Feast Fit for a King, I moved from living full-time in Soho in that loft, which I still have and still live there. But I moved out to Amagansett, Long Island, and bought some property and had a pond on it. I started gardening. I started planting things. I started digging in the earth. I started listening to birds chirp again. I started putting out feeders. There was all kinds of wonderful wildlife around. And the beach was just up the road, so I could hear the sound of the ocean. And so my work for a period there took on a very much more, much less tense and psychologically challenging side. It took on a much more romanticized side of nature because I was very happy. I was in a new relationship. I had a young son that I was so happy to in my life. I had, a new wife and a new life out in Amagansett. And so a lot of the early 90s and the 90s pieces begin to reflect that. But there's still, I want my work to be very emotional. And I try to bring a kind of a psychological religiosity, fanatical approach to my painting, because that, to me, I'm not skilled enough to paint with just facility to create that. I'm only skilled enough if I completely get immersed in it. And I want my paintings to be unsettling and shocking in some ways, and yet beautiful. And I want them to confront the viewer. And I want them also to suck the viewer into the painting. So often you'll see a beautiful entrance, and like in this, in the middle, very consciously put right in the middle as a doorway, and you go into the middle of that landscape, and then you're in it, and then you start to go back in through it. And so that's one way of approaching that. That's the way I wanted to be back in that again.
Well, but we need to move on from this, but I would like to say, you know, with 10 Mile Bayou, with Bill's piece, you know, there's no broken trees, there's no dying trees. It's pastoral and romantic, yet there's still that sky, that kind of Hudson River School, foreboding, drama-filled sky in the background. And is that an intentional choice?
Well, I'm very much a student of American landscape painting from the 19th century. And it's an area that I've always found interesting to me. And I've studied it for the last 35, 40 years, because early on in my career, showing with Meredith Long in Houston, he was a dealer who had Winslow Homer in his gallery, and Sargent and William Merritt Chase, and all the greatest of the 19th century American painters, Andrew Wyeth from later. And so I was very familiar with and George Ennis, my favorite. And so I was very conscious of their work and very influenced by it. So yes, they are, but it was not just the physical approach to their work, but the psychological. They were very much the early precursors of the environmental movement. They all were very conscious of the decline of the environment, and even back in 1860s and 70s. And their symbolism abounds in their work to demonstrate their concerns. And one of the things that was often used was the stormy sky, the foreboding sky, they call it. So yes, that's, seldom will you see a pristine blue. I don't think I've ever done a painting with a pristine blue sky before. Maybe I should.
Talk about foreboding.
Well,
Fishman.
Okay. If you will indulge me, I'm going to read, if I may, about this picture, because I got confused when I saw it because of the symbolism. But I'm going to try to really explain this picture, because it's really one of the very few in my entire, many pictures in my career of over 2,000 pictures have me in them. In fact, most figurative work I've done has me in it. But this is one of the most overtly self-portraits. And I want to read to you a brief paragraph that the great Jane Livingston wrote in the Smithsonian and Museum of Fine Arts Houston catalogs about this particular painting. It takes 1 minute to read, so bear with me. Several telling works from the period diverge significantly from the main current of my work, which is obvious with this. This is what, 2001. One of them is Spear Fishman, a self-portrait, although probably, wait a minute. And in this painting, Alexander portrays himself standing knee-deep in shallow, turbulent ocean water, wearing hip-high fishing boots, carrying in one hand a kerosene lamp and holding in the other a wooden pole of indeterminate purpose. The lamp's reflection in the churning water creates a centrifugal energy of the composition, creates the centrifugal energy of the composition. Fish swirl around him, both in the air and in the water. But the psychological center of the picture is the artist's face. This may be the most literal self-likeness the artist has ever attempted. It is an unmasked visage, familiar dark circled eyes, the instantly recognizable head, the mouth, the nose, the chin. What takes this image into the realm of fantasy and metaphor out of the category of the literal is the expression of the eyes. Distended, wide, staring, and its unnaturally lunar luminescence. So these eyes harken back to some of Alexander's very earliest drawings and painting. Often these eyes are attached to animals staring out at you, and also the eyes appear in masked human faces. So that's Jane Livingston's interpretation of this picture. Now, if you remember in 1981, 20 years earlier, I just kicked the down. 20 years later, I said, when you're looking at the Nature's River Nightmare, the first picture we looked at, if you'll look at the fish in the water, if you look at the bottom, you see, of course, it clearly, but in the middle right behind my legs are two fish that almost echo exactly, in different stylistically, the fish coming up out of the water in Nature's River Nightmare. So that symbolism continues to abound in my work. But in this, it's got the as Jane said, this rod. Again, it's got to me, it seems very kind of religious and biblical. And it's, you know, it's almost like, I hate to say this, but like one of the wise men trying to find the birthplace of Christ. This man is searching for something. It's searching for something that's, as he's staring out at you, and you're staring back at him, because this is another giant painting. This is 10 feet high. This figure is almost life size in the painting. It's a very epic kind of big picture. So if you look at that face of the artist, which Jane talked about as a centrifugal force in the middle of it, I'm looking at you as you look at it. And so that connection between the viewer standing there and me looking at you while you're looking at me is a hauntingly successful, I hope, attempt to connect my work and me to the viewer in the gallery or museum, and in this case, a gentleman's home. I wish it wasn't a museum, but.
Well,
and the flying fish, what are the flying fish trying to escape from? There's clearly, first of all, I don't think flying fish fly at night, but maybe nobody knows because you couldn't see them. But I put them in there, and maybe they represent a fish version of my birds. There's a lot of surrealism in my work, especially this. But I would be delighted, because we don't have that much time left, to open this up at some other point today or whatever, to let other people give their thoughts, because well, it's one of my 10 favorite paintings I ever did.
Absolutely. And before we move on from it very quickly, what this thing says to me is exactly that. Those fish, as someone who's been out wade fishing before in the shallows and gigging for flounder at night, if fish started freaking out and flying around my head all of a sudden, I would have that look of terror on my face as well, because
what do I see? I'm looking at something.
There's something in the water.
Yeah,
there's something bigger in the water. And
coming toward.
I think it's that, you know, just like nature's afraid, the symbolism for me in this piece, just as nature is under threat, so is man. So are we. You know, and that's what I've always taken from this piece, is that fear.
Thank you. That's between you and Jane, y'all can explain it. I can't. I'm fumbling around here. But let me say this too. It just occurred to me. The lantern that I'm holding is literally over there in my studio. It's hanging on the wall. And it's a lantern someone gave me from the railroad. It's a railroad lantern from the turn of the century, from the Long Island Railroad that runs back and forth from Montauk to the city. So it's a railroad lantern.
Wow, yeah, that's even
just
more resonance there. It goes back to Glory Bound, which have similar compositions as well. And just like those birds are going, what the hell is happening? Looking at the train, you as a human being are having that same experience because something bigger and scary is in the water with you. But
that's also a very overt. It's very overt statement about my fascination with and my obsession with Goya, because that is very much a Goya-like painting coming from me. I mean,
Right.
a full figure
You know,
standing out in some strange environment like that reminds me of a Goya of a man bent over with a rod, walking in what is obvious a very serious blizzard, and you feel how cold he is and how lonely he is in that Goya. It's a very, very famous Goya from early in his career, but it's there's a lot of that in this picture, because I was very familiar with that Goya, and I didn't sit down and copy it, but
right.
they just sneak in. You know, it's like it's just in your palate.
Well, we could talk about this for an hour alone, but let's move on to Thistles and Finch, a little more of a romanticized view of nature. But what I'd like to point out is that even when you're depicting nature in harmony, nature in this romantic with songbirds and flowers, there's prickles and sharp edges and a little danger there. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I can't help myself. I have to always put tension. I think if you put tension and you put mystery in your work, my work, I can't speak for other. As this entire time, I'm only speaking for myself and about myself. I'm not trying to lecture. I'm talking about me, which is hard to do. I'm being very open, I think. And maybe it's because of this hideous crisis we're in, and my county alone has 42,000 cases within, just a few miles of me, one of the highest intensely affected counties in the entire United States, maybe the world. There's tension, and I'm feeling tension right now. Everything I do, I get my groceries out of the back of my pickup truck with a shovel. I'm so afraid. I mean, I've never lived in fear like this before, but anyway, I'm not the only one. So this picture, which was done in 2012, it's a great example, I hope, of my work where you have tension and you have a little danger, like one of those, like your mother would say, you're going to put your eye out if you keep playing around with those sharp things. But those little finches know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly how to navigate that dangerous terrain. And it's based on real observation, as almost everything I do is, because there's a lot of those little yellow finches out here, but not so much anymore, but 10, 20 years ago, there were a lot of them. And we have a lot of thistles right outside my studio in the middle of the summer. And so I became obsessed with these little creatures in those thistles. And it's literally a literal interpretation of something I directly looked at from observation, and painted much of it outdoors, outside my studio, where I had a setup where I work outdoors in the summer. So that is, and look at that sky though. That's about as happy a sky as I can do that.
You're right. And that's
but it's still got that little
intentionally hopeful piece.
There's something on there.
I think, coming from the wilds of South Texas, even in nature at its healthiest, at its most romantic, there's moccasins and spiders and all sorts of things that can hurt you in the wild. And nature at its best is not necessarily a serene, non-violent place, especially if you're from the American South. But
100% that's accurate.
7 Scarlet Ibis searching for a throne. Now, this is the image we use to kind of promote this exhibition, because I think it's one of the most beautiful. Your sense of color, the paint quality, the composition of the piece is so gorgeous, and yet it is dark. This is a very dark and kind of foreboding piece.
Can we use the term brooding?
Yeah. But talk a little bit about this and what symbolism and narrative you've kind of woven into this painting.
Well, 2013, now we're moving along here at a pretty good clip, but first of all, let me say the title, Seven Spanish Angels, is seeped in symbolism. And that is because one of my top 10 favorite songs in my life is Willie Nelson and Ray Charles' gorgeous Seven Spanish Angels.
Yes.
Most people, I'm sure, that are hearing us today are familiar with that. But I became, as time has gone on, more and more conscious of, in my own environment out here, especially for many, many reasons, the destruction of habitat, not unlike in our beautiful Gulf Coast, south of New Orleans and along the Cajun country, along the Gulf Coast, that the habitat is being rapidly diminished, to say the least, at almost now light speed. And given the current state of political affairs, it's going to pick up even faster, this destruction, wanton destruction of nature. But I picked these birds because I thought that they're about as beautiful. This is a real bird. They're very, very occasional along the Gulf Coast, except in the southern tip of Florida. But they're very common in Cuba. They're very common in Trinidad. They're very common in parts of South America. And this is literally what they look like. I mean, these are scarlet ibises. Now we have a million ibises along the Gulf Coast, and they even venture pretty far north, but along the coast we have plenty. So these scarlet ibises, to me, represented the most beautiful bird I could think of. But the ibises are placed in a foreboding landscape that doesn't offer them any comfort. It doesn't offer them any secure place to nest or hide. There are no leaves. There's no branches with growth on them. So it's almost apocalyptic. But yet in the middle of this apocalyptic environment, this strange kind of almost Chernobyl-like landscape, where we've had here in Eastern Long Island and certainly in Australia and certainly in the West, and sort of forest fires by the gazoo and all this, we have hurricanes along the coast. So there's wanton destruction of nature that's created not by man, but created by natural, maybe the extremes are caused by man, but nature is dangerous. Nature's mean, nature's cruel to its inhabitants. And yet, look at what I wanted to portray is that, hold on. Because I've been quarantined for 6 weeks, I don't talk to anybody.
Right.
So anyway, I'm losing my voice.
That's quite all right.
Anyway, if you look at these majestic birds, they carry themselves with absolute dignity and absolute, there's a presence to them that's almost otherworldly. And if you look in the middle of the painting, there's a light there that's glowing.
Mm-hmm.
Now that light, to me, symbolizes hope, because I don't want to be the grumpy old codger that's doom and gloom all the time, because I do believe that I don't believe that. So there's like an uplifting of the spirit in that beautiful sky behind them, and that glow, that's an iridescent glow. Now, again, we're talking about a painting that's 7 or 8 feet or 70 something inches. So if you stand in front of that painting, you can see what I'm talking about. But it's very uplifting in spite of the fact that there's all that tension and drama created by the interlocking limbs. And it's again, a good example of I think whatever I can do in that particular realm, it's one of the better examples I can find.
It's one of the finest paintings of yours I've ever seen, and your sense of color is absolutely stunning, especially when you get into those lower parts of the branches, and the color that you're using there, and the color choices you've made, and the paint quality. And also, I think is a precursor to your most recent work that has this kind of amazing mark making with the branches, kind of like a Bryce Marden drawing in paint. It's really, really a stunning painting. But just let's move on for time's sake. And one of my absolute favorite paintings you've ever created, that lives here in New Orleans, as a matter of fact.
Well, actually, several of these works live in New Orleans, and in the South. Not all of them. That one doesn't. That last one, the Scarlet Ibis, lives in somewhere else, but it's in a good home.
But Memory Lane, again, the number 7. You've got the 7 pelicans here, and a little backstory on this painting. Right after we had the 2012 exhibition of John Alexander's work at the Ogden Museum, we took it to the Walter Anderson Museum of Art, because it was a 2-person show, Walter Anderson, John Alexander. And after we had a panel discussion at the Walter Anderson Museum of Art, I said, John, I want to show you something. And we pulled over on the side of the road, this little marina that I know in Ocean Springs. And I know that they feed the fish, feed the pelicans when the boats come in. And so I pretended like I had some fish and waved my arms around. And John's studio assistant and I were sitting down at the marina, and all of these pelicans started flying in and landing clumsily on the water. And John was like a 8-year-old kid. He was jumping around with joy with all of these pelicans flying in. And y'all must have taken 200 photographs that day. And I think this painting are those pelicans from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. But this marina and this painting is very also dark and foreboding. And this marina is just gnarly, and the broken fish nets and chains hanging there. So just tell us a little bit about this piece, John.
Okay, this is one that is easy to talk about, and it's, you know, if you think of I've never believed that young artists or any artist should try to be original. I don't think that's possible, to be original. They all in graduate schools today try to get these people to be cutting edge and original. You can't force that. And everything you think is so original, somebody else has really done it before. It's some various form or another. What you want to shoot for, in my opinion, is unique. And if you think of one of my other favorite painters is Cézanne, and you look at Cézanne with the, you know, a table with a bunch of apples and a bowl. There's something that happens in Cézanne's work that is unsettling. It's out of kilter. And the table might be out of kilter and tilted. Why don't these apples fall off? But yet they're so beautiful, and yet you can tell a Cézanne painting from 50 yards away going down the street on the side of a bus, because everybody in the world has painted apples, but Cézanne brought to those subjects his unique vision. So in that light, I'm not comparing myself to Cézanne, that would be silly, but I'm comparing myself to the spirit of how he approaches his work, in that I want this painting to be slightly out of kilter, because when I was little, the pelican, the brown pelican especially, and some white pelicans were very common on the Texas Gulf Coast and Louisiana Gulf Coast. And then by the time I was in high school, they'd gone away because of DDT and so forth. And so they were basically almost extinct, at least on the Gulf Coast. So then they slowly, because of environmental laws, began to come back. Well, so when we saw those pelicans that day, you and Ashley and I, we absolutely, I mean, I just was like, oh my God, and my mind just started racing back to my childhood. And so the tension in this painting is created by the the use of the ropes. Those ropes don't really need to be there, but I've got them crisscrossing around and under the pelicans pull tight, as if they're as tight as they can be pulled. And then the chains, the kind of the obvious, awful Southern significance and symbolism of chains. And then they're standing there in this kind of rusted wreck of a pier. I don't like to go to like the yacht basin in Miami and see, in Palm Beach and see those new beautiful piers. I like to see good old Southern rundown, you know, white top piling pier with a lot of old bird droppings on it. That to me is like beautiful music in terms visually. It's very sculptural to me. It's very symbolic of a past that's no longer there. So I found that this painting, because each pelican is looking in a different direction, and now the sky itself brings a whole lot more drama. I mean, I want this painting to be confrontational and full of drama. And if you think of the great Turner, the great British painter Turner, and his skies and his light and the grand scale of struggle in his paintings with the sea and the ships being torn apart, and just Turner at his classic best. He's another one of my very favorite painters, along with Goya, especially for nature paintings. And that sky to me is a very Turner-like attempt. And I think that this struggle there that the birds face, the pier faces from collapse or whatever, and then in the sky you have a struggle between the beautiful sunset that's about to appear, or is storm clouds going to engulf that? So you've got all these different forces working in different directions, pulling you, like the ropes, the tension of the ropes pulling it apart. Instead of holding it together, they're pulling at it. Do you see that, or am I just babbling?
Absolutely, and you know, it's one of my favorite paintings you've ever made, partially because I have a personal connection to it, not only with a place, but with a specific instance. But also, it's an environmental success story. The Pelicans came back. There's still danger. But there's the hint, the pink in the sky. There's a hint of a sunset. But there could be a storm, just as you're saying, and all of that tension combined makes it one of my favorite pieces. Now we've got
one of their biggest threats was the nets.
Yeah, the bells of St. Augustine just informed me that we probably should not continue anymore with the slideshow, and should open this up. We should open this up to any questions.
Well, just run through them. We're going to talk about them. Just run through them. Let's see what they got.
I'll do a quick share again.
That's a good place to stop, because it's
beautiful night lilies.
No need to talk about that.
From 2018, one of your wonderful drawings. And Southern Gothic, which is also here, not only here in New Orleans, but not just 3 blocks from my house. I know it lives. And a gorgeous depiction of nature in harmony.
Well, that's a picture that I was going to go out on, but the Pelicans is a good place to stop.
Well, we'll stop with Southern Gothic right now, and I'll stop sharing. And I want to ask if there are any questions from the people at home watching. Now's your time to type it in the chat or the question and answer section of the Zoom.
I hope I didn't get too personal, because I don't.
No, I don't believe so. I believe this was fabulous. I mean, I enjoyed it. I don't know if everyone else enjoyed it.
How do you like my makeup? I got myself made up for this.
I'd also like to say thank you to Lauren West, your studio assistant, for helping out, providing images, taking last-minute requests. Lauren, you want to step in and wave?
Us, West. Let's get West in this picture.
Hey guys, I'm wearing a mask.
Excellent.
Yeah, we don't we don't take this lightly here, man.
All right, we have Susie and Ted Block, to all the panelists, said, how about we talk about the last painting? So
What painting?
I'm assuming she meant Southern Gothic. So let's go back to it. Yes, Southern Gothic, she says. So John, tell us a little bit about Southern Gothic.
Well, let me see. I'm gonna have to make this up. I don't have any notes. Oh, sorry. Oh, I see. Yeah.
You have notes?
Southern Gothic. When you think of the South, I mean that's we all, most of us, I guess, that are listening and that are participating, we all grew up in the South, and there's something about the South that has each family has this there's always somebody in that family that's very unsettling, and it's always that guy or that, that uncle, that creepy uncle, or the deranged, cousin who, the family doesn't like to talk about, or whatever.
I think I'm that guy in my family. I don't know,
but in Southern, when I say something is Southern Gothic, or when somebody's like really epic in that, like, that guy that's like, oh God, he's in the penitentiary now. It's like that Gothic tale, or half the family was run over by a logging truck, or whatever it is. It's always that drama. So I was painting this picture, and it was for Arthur Roger, my beloved dealer, right there in New Orleans in Julius Street, 542 Julius, or 452 Julius. Open 9 to 5 Monday. Anyway, Arthur,
easy now.
He and I've been together for many, many years, and they've been such a moral and spiritual and financial support base for me, and the city of New Orleans has too, and we all share a love for that place. And so I thought for my exhibition, I really did kind of just want to paint a painting that I thought was just as beautiful as I could make a painting. And now my pond, when I painted that picture, is in full bloom, because I've got water lilies on my pond, a lot of them. And I've also got, I've spent a lot of money on this little pond. It's not very big, but it's about 3/4 of an acre, which is nice to have outside your kitchen. And I've covered it with pickerel rush and cattails and lots of water lilies. And so I wanted to do something for Arthur's last show that I just thought really just made people smile, and it made me smile, because I'd had a very bad period there with some health issues and some other stuff. And so I wanted to come out and just hit a home run with this thing. And I got so into it, and I found it so just raw power to the brush. I just wanted to be I wanted it to be powerful and compelling and beautiful. And I wanted this raw beauty to it. And for some reason, it started making me think of that epic Southern stuff, so I call it Southern Gothic. It's my idea of just the South and all of its beauty, its pathos, its poetry, its narrative. All that stuff is summed up in Southern Gothic. And so I wanted to make this one great statement painting about that. And maybe just because I'm getting older, I've softened. But there's not a lot I've actually got 2 more like that I'm working on right now, oddly enough. Maybe it's just getting old and I've softened, but there's not a whole lot more to say about it other than I wanted raw power, I wanted mystery, and I wanted beauty. And I really threw myself like some crazed fanatic into making that painting and making it work. And it was beautifully installed. And my kudos to Arthur and them for putting up with me for all these years there in New Orleans. Same thing for Bob McLean over in Houston, and for Gruen out in San Francisco. I mean, to have to put up with me through all this is not, it's not an easy chore, you know what I mean? But, and
Well,
look,
you do have great gallerists, I will say that, but raw
Lauren
power,
for long
beauty,
suffering.
mystery.
Let's
That
take
pretty
another
much.
question.
Well, the last question we have is from William Andrews, who said, it was really great to hear us both talk about your work. When can we do it again? We can do this every day. No, I'm kidding. We can't do this every day, but I'd be happy to do it again. I guess that's all for now.
Well, let me say this. Let me say this in summation. William Andrews knows for a fact, because we've talked about it, and I mean it. I'll do just anything I can for the Ogden. I think that institution is, as I said earlier, is very important, and it means a lot to me. It's been very good to me, and been very good to many artists. Been very good to the entire region and beyond. So if I can do anything to help, you know, you can count on me. I do think we should do another one of some sort, though, because we're just getting started.
Agreed.
You know?
Agreed. Jesse Haynes says, thank you, John. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank them and thank all the support that all of you in the Richardson Society give to the Ogden, because like I couldn't exist without people supporting and helping me. The Ogden couldn't exist without you. So all of you involved, bless you all, and thank you very much for what you do. And
well, actually, we got one more question. Susie and Ted Block says, have you found that the social isolation is stimulating to your creative process?
It's making me, I said something to somebody today, this morning, that on the phone, that I'm reading more, and oddly enough, reading about art more, and I'm retaining more, and I'm more focused. And yes, I think that, in fact, I think Lauren would agree with me. We've talked about it. I'm more hyper-focused right now than I've been, I think, in a long time. I don't have to think about getting shower and go out to some restaurant. I mean, I'm here. You want to reach me, call me at 10:30 tonight. I'll be right here where I am now, turned around facing that canvas behind me. By the way, that canvas behind me with the birds is coming to New Orleans
Excellent.
In about 3 weeks. So you probably can't see it unless you just peer through a window or something.
In 3 weeks, we might be open down here.
Well, you know, that's the other thing.
Michael Wilkinson wanted me to tell you that it's still okay to shower, John.
Well, yeah, but you never know what's in that water, man. This virus is everywhere. But, you know, what we could do too, in lieu of, I mean, I like this format very, very much. But, you know, down the road when the airplanes fly again and life returns to some normalcy, maybe we'll all get together in New Orleans and have some kind of function where we all can sit down in a big room, and show some pictures like this, and I can look you in the eye, Richardson Society, and talk to you directly, and you can talk to me directly, and we'll have some fun. And I know William will get us some good wine, and
some good bourbon.
Some good bourbon, and we'll sit down and we'll be able to look at each other and be in the same proximity, and hopefully be able to shake each other's hands and smile.
I think that's a good place to end this thing. Claire, would you like to jump in and sign us off?
Thank you so much. John, that was really amazing. It was great to get some background on some of these pieces, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to get to experience this exclusive process with us. I'm excited that we got to do it, and hopefully we can do it again.
Well, I hope I wasn't too long-winded.
No, not at all. It was wonderful.
All righty. Now I'm going to put my mask back on.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, and y'all have a great evening.
Bye-bye, love.
Thank you.